Howard Williams has over 27 years of experience in academic teaching and research. I've read that off his biog at the university, and I imagine it may be more than 27 years, perhaps. He joined the University of Chester in 2008 and was appointed Professor of Archaeology there in 2010. Howard's research explores the archaeology of death, burial, and commemoration in Britain and Scandinavia in the Middle Ages, focusing in particular on early medieval Wales and the Anglo-Saxon and Viking worlds. We've been doing a lot of rethinking in Cornwall of Roman archaeology. So what about the Vikings in Cornwall? So Howard's talk is Rethinking Viking Archaeologies, and he promises, I think, to touch on Cornwall. So thank you very much for joining us, Howard, and we look forward to your talk. I should say one more thing, because I always forget this. If you have any questions or comments to make, please use the chat facility at the bottom of the screen. We'll save all those questions, and Mike Atwell will chair the questions and comments section at the end of the talk. So thank you very much again, Howard.
Thank you so much. And before I begin, it's only just come to my knowledge, obviously, through this announcement joining this evening of Andy's passing. So I thought it might be appropriate to just point out that I have a conversation on my YouTube channel with Andy from a few months ago. Let me just bear with me how I work out how to share, because every time I go on Zoom, it changes. Share participant, one share at a time. No, I don't want to do that, do I? I want to just share my screen. How do I do
I need to
that?
stop sharing myself, maybe, to make you able to share yours.
Oh, maybe that's it.
Yes.
So share screen. Okay. Bear with me a second, please, because I'm used to using Teams.
It's in the middle of
Yeah,
the
here we
bottom
are.
there.
Sorry, forgive me. I was just having a bit of a brain meltdown there. So yes, I just wanted to quickly share this to start with, that this is the opening slide for me and Andy talking about 5 months ago about his passion, interest, expertise in the Cornish prehistoric periods, multiple, and I thought that's just a very, very sad news, and I hope that in some ways a small sort of recognition of his work, and I've long respected, and I'm glad I had an opportunity to have a conversation with him.
Thank you very much, Howard. Thank you.
Okay, so without moving on to my talk for this evening, which does share many of the themes that Andy has recently been publishing on too, thinking about death, memory, personhood. How do we approach the archaeology of the Viking Age, and particularly death and burial in the Viking Age? But I want to start off with a broader theme. Now, I'm going to rattle through a lot of slides here because I want to give you like a kind of sort of gish gallop of lots of ideas, a zoom through lots of ideas about my ongoing research on the Viking Age. I mean, I have done a lot of research on the early Middle Ages and touched on the Viking Age at multiple points. And I have a love-hate relationship with the Vikings, the Viking Age, the concepts, the themes, which are so popular they cannot be avoided. They are the poster boys and girls of the early Middle Ages, if you like. We may love them, loathe them, but they're everywhere in our popular culture and our society. And I think it's a number of my recent publications have been trying to deal with this relationship between our Vikings, what we think the Vikings are and what we want them to be, and the archaeological record. So I'm going to try and do both, look to the past and try and interpret some archaeological evidence for Viking death rituals, and then look at how we can actually approach our own society with that same critical eye of how we interpret the way we're creating visions of the Vikings. And then at the end, I hope I have some things to say about Cornwall, because you might think Cornwall has very little to do with the Vikings. I think most books that I see on the Viking world or with the Viking diaspora think that too. But I think there's a lot more to say. And I think whether we like it or not, the Vikings aren't going away. And if you look at any map of the Viking world, sometimes Cornwall's included, sometimes it's not, as areas of Viking interaction and activity. Not all these. No, I found no single map that I find satisfactory. This is from a recent, as you can guess, a DNA study of burial archaeogenetics in the Viking world. But it serves in this purpose to remind us that it's the period that attracts more interest than any other, perhaps. And yet it's more misunderstood and confused than any other, including where and what it is, and what caused it, and what were the consequences of it. And I think the opening point is that there's no single Viking age, there's no single Viking world. It's a mishmash of very different intensities and scales and interactions of Scandinavia with different parts of northern, western, eastern, and southern Europe and the Mediterranean. In other words, we don't even have clear definitions of its boundaries. You can extend it all the way to North America, you can extend it all the way to the Caspian Sea if you want to, or you can simply talk about the North Sea, the Irish Sea, the Baltic. And there are many ways in which we can think about the Vikings. I don't know if my text is going to be overlaid by interactions or announcements, but I'll try to hopefully to make the point that if you can see all this, that the Vikings are everywhere. But why the Vikings? Well, they have many appeals to us, and they have since the 19th century. Ideas of the ultimate barbarian, of militarism, of being hyper-masculine, hyper-feminine. There's lots of ideas about sex, gender, and sexualities, of looking like a Viking that our society is obsessed with, that it has an impact on archaeology and what we can attest and what we can't attest from our data. It's about social identities and communities, ideas of adventuring, exploring, seafaring. Some see the Vikings as proto-capitalists, early merchants. Others see them as nation builders. Some of them see them as sort of Nordic hippies, sort of they're spiritual, they're in commune with the old gods. Others see them as sort of pagans who made good. It's the time of conversion to Christianity, and so it's the building blocks of nation and Christendom. Some people see the Viking Age as a time of ecological commune, and others like to think about the Vikings as makers and as well as traders. And with all of that, there's many different scales. Some people see the Vikings as about a sort of early white Northern European people. Others see them as Europeans, and they're often been framed as Europeans or as European colonists and as having a colonial identity. And that appeals a lot in Scandinavia and in the Americas. There's lots of nationalist origin myths, regional stories, and civic and local stories. My region has the Wirral on its doorstep, and people on the Wirral love the Vikings. And it's very different from a Merseyside identity or a Cestrian identity or a Flintshire identity. The Wirral and their Vikings is a local story. And that's just to give you examples. And there's various ways, and this is something that archaeologists have to be very aware of, and I think they're not often thinking about. It's not about the obsession with Vikings isn't so much about who we were or where we came from as who we are and who we want to see ourselves as. And there's all manner of bizarre uses of the Vikings to stoke fear of and hatred towards foreigners. There's all sorts of classist ideas, all manner of religious bigotries that get wrapped up in our pop culture ideas of the Vikings, ideas about what it is to be a man and a woman, to be a person. And a lot of our stereotypes seem comic and ridiculous, but they, even when they're adapted and changed, we may have got rid of the horned helmet, they still have power to be used by various modern culture wars debates. And we've seen politicians evoke the Vikings very recently in a whole series of ways in British and English and Welsh and elsewhere's political discourses. But again, this is all introduction, just to get your brains thinking about how the Vikings are a bit of have an appeal, but are a challenge for us as archaeologists. Because here, my recent visit to Stavanger Museum to show you some really cool Viking Age artifacts and rune stones and images. The Vikings are in our heritage spaces. but they're also in the landscape of that we inhabit. Here's some photographs of Swedish burial sites from the late Iron Age, from the Viking Age. That cow isn't Viking Age, but it's guarding a sign that marks an Iron Age cemetery. And of course, this is an aerial view of the proto-urban site of Birka and its burials. There's a landscape of the Viking Age and the periods immediately before and after. And I've got to get a selfie in. This is me at Haversfjord, near Stavanger, the legendary site of the battle that forged, well, in popular story, forged Norway, and the monument that has for the last half century marked the legendary spot. Also in Stavanger, the football team, the Vikings, the local football team, has its indoor football arena. And elsewhere in the Viking world, in our museums, we don't have a single clear line between real Vikings and fantasy Vikings, because only a couple of generations ago this was seen as authentic Viking garb for reenactors on the Isle of Man. And of course, we have many forged Vikings, such as the most famous runestone of the Viking world is actually a forgery from the very end of the 19th century. Of course, the famous Minnesota Kensington runestone that many still think is actually real and was entertained and indulged as a genuine find of medieval Norse venturers into the American Midwest for many decades through the early mid 20th century, but it keeps coming back via YouTube. But it's but this is still, and this is my point, still part of our modern imaginings of the Vikings. And my approach to this, as with early medieval archaeology generally, is that as archaeologists, we have to denounce false and pseudo stories, fictitious ideas. But we have to create new stories as well. We can't just go, well, that's wrong, and oh no, the Vikings weren't like that. We're dealing with such a pop culture phenomenon, from video games and films to heritage sites and local town squares. We've got to think of ways we connect with this. And I think that's something for Cornwall to consider as well. We can't ignore the Vikings as much as we may wish to. And because people want to consume the Vikings. Vikings are everywhere in our pop culture, our consumerist culture. This is at Stavanger Airport on my way back. So you can everything from bottle openers to fridge magnets. And more local to me, this is Macclesfield, where you can throw axes like a Viking. And this all may seem far removed from the archaeological record, but I can't move or talk or breathe about the Vikings without having to deal with these stereotypes and these popular conceptions. And sometimes we laugh at them, as in the popular TV show Norseman from 2016, where they mock the idea of a horned helmet by one of the characters going, "Fashion is about taking chances, experimenting, daring to be bold." It tells a story, and everyone's laughing at his silly horned helmet. And of course, there is a more serious and disturbing element, such as the Stop the Steal rally on the 6th of January 2021, where the poster boy of the riot, of course, had not only Old Norse pagan symbols, but a headgear that was widely misrepresented as being to do with the Vikings. And this is obviously there's been an ongoing conversation in American global culture about the extreme far right use of the Vikings as poster boys and symbols of white nationalism. And the problem is, the way I would approach it is that we can't escape all that. You can easily say, oh, that's all dross on the surface, we can get back beyond that. But I would say we can't, because for every time we look at or discuss the Gosforth Cross, or we just go to the Jorvik Heritage Centre, or we watch a good YouTube video by someone like Dr. Jackson Crawford, who is a really good scholar of Old Norse language, talking about the sources, whether we're at a Viking festival, we've got to deal with all these other interleaving ideas about the Vikings and the Viking Age. And like it or not, our August Scholarly Society for Medieval Archaeology, as of their last style guide for their academic journal, still would consider the term Viking to apply for Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. Cornwall isn't mentioned. Maybe we should have a word with them about that. But they do accept that for England, late Saxon and Anglo-Scandinavian are allowed in their journal, but Viking is still there. So this term, this concept of a ninth to 11th century Viking Age, Viking world, is intimately linked in with all of these other ideas about Vikings and all of these of what they are. And this all goes back, of course, to the late 19th century, because actually it was only in the late 19th century that the concept of a Viking Age became firmed up in Danish archaeological scholarship by Jens Vorsa, and became increasingly used in national histories that have spread out and become utilized across these islands too. And today, particularly for death ritual, of course, Vikings are known, perhaps more than any other, apart from the ancient Egyptians, for their attitudes and treatments of the dead, mainly mythological concepts that have spread into popular culture. So here's some filmic references to boats, from everything from the fantasy worlds of Tolkien and J.R.R. Martin to the 1958 film and one of the Marvel Universe films, Thor: The Dark World, which shows sort of mass Viking style burial funerals over on the water. And so for me, one of the ways into this is to think about how does death get represented in these modern portrayals versus what we can say from the archaeological record. And so I thought I'd just share with you some case studies of how we, and I'm not alone in this, many other archaeologists have been doing this over recent decades, try to deal with the Vikings by breaking it down, looking at, trying to not simply debunk the stereotype, but also showing what we can say from archaeological evidence about what Viking period people, whatever their ethnic or linguistic nature were, how they were dealing with the dead. And this is a way in, I think, a really important way in to how allowing the Viking Age, the people of the Viking Age, now long gone, to speak in varied ways to us through the archaeological data that sort of challenge and subvert some of these pop culture representations. So let me give you a few case studies of how we can do that, how we can make the dead speak in a positive way that gets away from some of these more pernicious and pervasive stereotypes. So my first case study is thinking about how we can look at archaeological evidence for the Viking Age, for the burials, and think about how in the Viking Age, death was about a dialogue with graves and landscapes. And this comes from fieldwork I did with Dr. Martin Rundqvist in Sweden in the mid-noughties, and some publications that stemmed from that. And these are the three publications. And we were working at a site that hadn't been investigated by modern techniques before, one of an isolated, near unique for the province it's in, surface traces that seem to be a Viking boat grave cemetery. And these are two maps to sort of locate you and to point out that this, while there are a couple of other possible sites nearby, this cemetery stood out in its region, that many of the Vendel or the immediately preceding period of the later 6th, 7th and early 8th century and then Viking Age boat graves are known from the Lake Mälaren region, but this site is to the south on its own on the Vikbolandet Peninsula. And in the broader Scandinavian context, you see it's a sort of an isolated dot. And yet it has very distinctive surface features that seem to suggest a very prominent and space-gobbling way of disposing of the dead, to inter the dead in some kind of seagoing vessel and ship burial. And so from the surface traces and the first survey we did, topographical survey we did, that never been properly done, we were able to pick out that there was a cluster of smaller mounds at the tip of a boat-shaped peninsula, and I'll show you that from the air in a little while, but then a line of 8 and 2 further offset boat-shaped stone settings, low stone settings. These aren't great mounds, but with boat-shaped depressions where a collapse has taken place after of a burial chamber within a ship, leaving these boat-shaped depressions on this ridge. And we did an excavation that was very simple, a very shallow monument. We stripped, mapped, and excavated the monument and revealed careful details of the alignment of the depression, and found that it was a very careful aligned collapse. I won't go into all the details here, but to make the point that this was a very roughly octagonal, one stone thick layer. It was more like a layer of a platform for performance rather than a burial mound, as we would perhaps conceptualize it, with a very prominent central stone that may have marked a sort of symbolic mast, or at least marked the center of the ship for people to mark where the grave had been. And we excavated, and it was very poorly preserved, and no human remains survived. We did get some fragments of animal bone, but most of it was very poor quality ironwork, including the X's here are all marks of possible clench nails from the ship. We found an iron hook and a ring and frost nails that may have been for horses, winter horses' shoes, and also a bead, as well as the most distinctive thing were 23 amber gaming pieces of a kind that sort of morphologically, in terms of their form, fit the early Viking Age. So we didn't get bone preservation, but we did get artifacts that fit the idea this was a boat grave of the early Viking Age. And for me, what was really interesting about this grave is that it was very porous, it was very open, it wasn't closed and protected, and it looks like it had been robbed. One of our scenarios, we can't be sure because the preservation was so poor, but it looks very likely, comparison with other Viking boat graves, that this grave lacked any big weapons, any bling. It may have been robbed by the family within a generation or two of the burial. And this is a phenomenon now being identified by Dr. Alison Klevnes and her colleagues across Scandinavia. This is a systematic social process of interaction with the dead. The dead were not laid to rest in perpetuity. The grave was a place of dialogue. And maybe even the gaming pieces were part of that ongoing conversation with the dead. And so this is a very interesting example of how we can use the careful archaeological evidence, though fragmentary and poorly preserved, to reveal a very different kind of localized practice of dealing with the dead by burying a ship, perhaps then revisiting the grave over multiple occasions. And this would have been a ridge that would have been distinctive, now surrounded by farmland, well drained, but in the Viking Age, it probably was surrounded by marshland, and it would have been a sort of like an island within that sort of wetland. And therefore, this would have been a distinctive platform for ceremonies and ongoing interactions with that grave. It's not a place to be avoided and respected and seen from afar. It's somewhere that was probably very close to the home farms in a sort of inland location, close to a series of farms that have surviving later Viking Age rune stones. And therefore, by looking at the grave goods, the structures, the monument, the landscape, the context, we can start to think about how these burials worked for the local communities as statements of status, maybe, and power, but also as places of intercession, of dialogues with the dead. This cliche of a Valhalla destination, of course, is from our later sources. We may be looking at instead a lot of these later Iron Age communities or early medieval communities think the dead are still in their local landscape, and their graves are places to be respected and venerated, but also to conduct further rituals and veneration at them. And when we take those ideas that Martin and I were playing with over sort of 15 years ago and look at what other archaeologists have been doing elsewhere in the Viking world, we can start to see that, yes, Viking period funerals could be elaborate theatrical performances, as the work of Professor Neil Price has argued, but they often involve very intimate and sequences of practices in which careful choices were being made over how to dispose of the dead. And a lot of the recent work done over the last decade and a bit on the Viking Age in Iceland sort of picks up that theme that I was talking about in Sweden. I'm not saying the same communities doing the same thing, different people, but there's the dead and the places of burial were places where people were going back and interacting with over the long term. So just to give you some examples, while again the graves are poorly, we would love to have well-preserved Viking period graves. They are furnished, but there's a really interesting sort of cemetery topography at the site of Dalvik, which is an early 20th century excavation, where it looks like the ridge is, as we don't know the exact chronology, but along the ridge, additional burials are being placed. And for many of these burials, you're digging two pits, one for a person, one for a horse. And horse sacrifice, we saw frost nails at Scamby, and there may have been horse sacrifice there, but we don't have it surviving. But here at Dalvik, there is evidence surviving of horse sacrifice. And Frida Norstein, Esplin Norstein, looks at one of the graves and as part of her doctoral thesis from 2020, and she conducts what she calls a thanatography, like a detailed sort of description of the funeral based on the evidence we have. It's a kind of a thick description, if you like, of how we can, though there's questions we can't answer and there's problems with how exactly we interpret the evidence, she sort of suggests we can think of the mortuary sequence very much as a way of remembering and forgetting the dead. And this is picking up ideas I've also worked with on early Anglo-Saxon burials, is that through we talked about our colleague Dr. Andy Jones has also been working on those ideas as well in his work on prehistoric sites in the southwest. So different times, different periods, different people, we're working with these ideas of how the funeral itself is a time of remembering and forgetting. And as well as going through the whole cemetery, she looks at burial 5, which you can see on the right of the screen. And the skull and leg bones are the only bits of the human remains surviving, but there are a series of selected objects and a horse grave to the north, a separate pit for the killing and sacrifice of a horse. No defined mound survives. So again, this isn't about grand monuments, but the choice of a single oval brooch or tortoise brooch, which is a type of brooch common to the Viking Age, with traces of textile and a knife at the hip, a stair-type bowl at the feet, may be careful choices, not simply personal possessions, but careful selections of objects by the mourners to remember the dead person. So it's about a dialogue between the living and the dead. And so that the fact this is one of a series of Icelandic burials, not with a pair of oval brooches as worn as part of adult women's dress, that you'd have a brooch on each collar or each breast, a single oval brooch being put in the grave, she suggests might be an heirloom, an object that's been selected to honor the dead, but not to dress them in a full, kit as they were in life. Where is the paired brooch? Had it been lost before, or was it kept back as a memento so that the dead have one brooch and the living keep the other? But either way, it's not functioning in the grave as it was intended. And the horse sacrifice seems to have been an important part of the ritual, a violent, bloody ritual, but also part of the honouring of this person and placing them in the grave, whether to evoke the idea of an afterlife journey, a transportation, a psychopomp animal to go off to the next world, or simply and in addition to honour the status and characteristics of that person. We don't know all of the details. There's still questions about the ordering of the graves, but it's a good example to help us think of a grave, these furnished graves, as not simply we must honor them and the person goes in and gets dressed in death, but perhaps a more complicated sequence of placing objects with the dead as a way of remembering and forgetting. And so the ideas I picked up at Scamby and then are seen by Frida in her work on the Dalvik site, we can pick up with another site from Iceland called Litla Nupa, which is a small abandoned farmstead that was the focus of survey and excavation in northeastern Iceland, and excavations from 2004 to 2010. And they found 9 graves. And again, the preservation could be better, but we have a mixture of horse, dog, and human burials. And the centerpiece is a boat burial, which seems to contain multiple individuals. Now, there's a lot of debates about how we interpret this evidence, but the excavators make the point that maybe the boat burial is like a family mausoleum, not open for one occasion, but as I was hinting at with the Scamby evidence, perhaps reopened again and again, and further burials placed in. And so there have been earlier finds on this site, and it's clear they haven't found all the graves. And again, as with Dalvik, these burials are aligned along the topography of the site. But they argue that burial 3, the boat grave, was kind of the core of the cemetery. And so, as you can see from the excavations, they've hardly convincingly found the parameters of the whole site, but from the this is on the edge of the home fields of the Icelandic farm of the 10th century. And this is the again, as with Scandi, this is what you get. You don't get a lovely, well-preserved Oseberg ship, which has obviously recently and famously moved to its new home, and it's all that miraculous, well-preserved wood. Here, you've just got carefully mapped dots that are the traces of poorly preserved clench nails and a little copper alloy bell. That's all you get. So these graves aren't particularly lavish and wealthy. They may have originally been, but maybe people are going back, removing objects, adding new burials in. The remains of 3 people, 2 males and 1 female, were found here, as well as the bell. And they have a hypothetical sequence. These graves are carefully aligned and also have post holes that seem to be carefully placed in relation to them. And they make the argument, I don't want to go through all of this in detail, that what we may be looking at is not a series of graves, each marking individual funerals, but instead horses being sacrificed, people being buried in a sequence, and then they're going back into these graves and moving the bodies into the central burial 3, the boat grave. Now, we can't prove, in concrete terms, an exact sequence here. We don't have that, refined radiocarbon dating and stratigraphy, but it's a really interesting project that helps us think, as we were thinking about at Scamby and at Dalvik too, that these cemeteries may not be simply places of deposition of the dead, but as the work of Marianne Moen has also recently shown, as well as Neil Price, who I mentioned before, that these cemeteries were places in the landscape people were going back to again and again to bury the dead, but also perhaps to sacrifice and to rearrange the dead, sort of creating almost like a place history as they're adding to the graves. And that's not actually so much different from a modern cemetery or churchyard in our society, but it's a very different kind of relationship to the grave. And so if you can stay with me on this narrative, we're looking at very different kinds of evidence, but hopefully you'll start to see how we can start to think of these Viking period death rituals in a slightly different way from the stereotype of farewell and an embarkation over water or into a grand burial mound. These are much more interactive spaces. And that applies also to the work I've done through 3 articles looking at the Hogmack stones, of which you in Cornwall have some possible outliers down at Llanovat in Cornwall. And these are a phenomenon that have been much discussed in the Viking period literature as colonial monuments of the Viking world, despite the fact that actually there's nothing particularly Viking about them. But there's a whole other debate and discussion we can have here. But this is James Lang's typology of these carved stone, 3-dimensional grave covers. I think that's the simplest way to describe hogbacks. Other scholars may disagree with that description, but to give you a sense of, they have end beasts in many occasions. Most of them are bears, but some kind of serpentine or nondescript monsters or beasts sort of bite at the ends of these, some of them vestigial, some of them more prominent, and some of them have elaborate ornaments along the sides and distinctive shingled roofs. They are skeuomorphs of wooden roofed buildings or canopies. And here's the famous ones from Brompton, which you might be familiar with. These are floating. They're found in the 19th century. Some of them went to Durham, where you can see them in the library. Repatriate them to Yorkshire, I say. And the rest are still in Brompton in Northallerton's church. And they are beautiful and striking. And imagine these would have originally been vividly painted, as most early medieval carved stone monuments would have been. You're starting to get a sense of a really striking way of honouring the dead that protected them with beasts and a kind of canopy structure. And they may have been originally paired with crosses. So there's been various speculation, they don't have Christian art on them, therefore they're pagan. I think most scholars would see this as these are Christian era converted Anglo-Scandinavian monuments, but not exclusively so. The Govan dynasty, the Brythonic-speaking dynasty of Strathclyde seem to have been using them too. And they seem to, at Brompton, be paired with these little crosses that may have been marking them as the graves as well. And we have some really elaborate scenes we can perhaps link to Norse mythology in some cases. I don't like to push it too far, but there's a whole scholarly debate about how much these scenes can be interpreted, as well as Christian scenes. So the Saint's Tomb, as it's called, at Gosforth on the Cumbrian west coast, does have seemingly crucifixion scenes on the narrow ends of these striking monuments, as well as a scene that has been interpreted. And again, I'm couching it a bit, has been, as Jormungandr and Thor fighting along the side. And again, I don't like to put a lot of confidence in these antiquarian interpretations of mapping mythology onto stone sculpture. But my point is, these really are a distinctive monument, a stone monument in a Christian context, but they link us to that theme of interaction, don't they? Because what you're doing really here with these carved stone monuments is you're marking graves, you're creating a heavy covering over graves to stop people meddling, they're blocking, but they're very much continuing the Christian late antique shrine tomb tradition, of which we have elements surviving from the header stone, from Peterborough Cathedral, from the Jedburgh shrine fragment, and of course the wonderful Lichfield angel that may have been part of the shrine of the Mercy and Saint Chad. And so we have, and the bead's description tells us of this active tradition in these islands of wooden and stone grave covers for the honoured dead, not simply the holy dead, but the hogbacks may be sort of taking that tradition and secularizing it. And so, but we also, of course, have close parallels with small portable reliquaries, such as the Monimus reliquary. And indeed, some of the bears on these monuments look like they're almost they're like clasps on the reliquaries. So for me, these bears are like gigantic, muscular, beastly protectors of the contents of this tomb. But I think in the Viking world, there would have been many kind of arch-shaped protected canopies, big and small, from halls and pagan temples, churches, tents, shrines, chests, caskets, right the way down to the various bow-shaped coverings of saddle bows, swords, and the tortoise brooches or the oval brooches I mentioned before. They don't all look alike, but they're all playing with the same idea of canopies that cover, protect. Some of them may be symbolic of the universe, of the mythological world, but they certainly are overlapping between a pre-Christian and a Christian context, a set of ideas of protecting the dead, canopying, enclosing the dead. And so for me, some of these monuments, the way perhaps to think about them is like in Christian carved stone versions of the burial mounds and the stone settings. They mark the graves, they protect them, but they facilitate, encourage ongoing interaction, whether it's prayers or, and we don't know the exact ordering in which these monuments at Brompton were carved. But here's my suggestion, that they are being carved by a dynasty of landowners who are perhaps like the Icelanders and the Swedes, who are burying their dead on ridges following the topography. They're marking out their graves as spaces to go back to say prayers, to leave offerings in a Christian context, to continue with a similar idea. And remember, in this Christian context, we've got increasing evidence in the Viking world of people wanting to go back to graves and retrieve their pagan ancestors to bury them elsewhere. And the most famous of these takes us back to Iceland, where we have the excavations taken place by Erlendsson, Bøyek and Zori into the grave of Egil, famous from Egil Skallagrimsson and his saga. And we know he died in around 990 and was buried in a mound in sight of his farm. And around 1000, a church was built, and his stepdaughter commands his body to be exhumed. This is all from the 13th century saga. And he's reinterred in the new church and remembered beneath the altar. And in the mid-12th century, they built a new church 500 meters to the east, and they exhume his bones again. And the priest thinks, well, I wonder if this is really the famed Egil. And so what do you do when you dig up a famed Viking's grave? Well, you stick the skull on the wall of the churchyard, you try to break it with your axe, and he couldn't. So it proves he's a Viking. This is what you do in Iceland in the 12th century. But that story aside, intriguing though it is, when the early church was investigated by the archaeologists, they discovered a grave right at the floor of the chancel of that first church that was empty. And they suggest it was exactly the place where the saga describes Egil's bones were removed from his pagan burial mound, placed beneath the altar. And so what we seem to have here is not conclusive, but it's really exciting matchup of a saga to archaeological excavation, which, immediately I'm cynical, but it's actually really quite tantalizing. Is you've got West East findless graves here, and then this right beneath the altar, maybe Egil's grave. Obviously empty because they carefully exhumed him to put him in the new church. But this is an example where we can see that care and attention to ancestors that spread across the pagan to Christian divide. And if that's not enough to make you convinced that the Viking period dead were not resting quietly, but they were always being respectfully meddled with, then maybe this helps us to think about some of these graves that some scholars have suggested are the graves of women warriors. And we can apply the insights from those 4 case studies to this final area of discussion. And this is a big controversial topic, so I'm going to upset everyone by zooming through this very quickly. But you may be aware that in 2017, an archaeogenetic and reanalysis of bones excavated in the 19th century at the Swedish proto-town I mentioned before of Birka found that the chamber grave, often used as an iconic representation of a Viking warrior's grave, turned out to be the burial of a biological woman in terms of the chromosomal biology of from the surviving ancient DNA. And so BJ581, the grave number, sitting in this striking location overlooking the town, has been brought back to life as a female warrior or a woman warrior with all her gear, her recurve bow, her sword, axe, multiple shields, and 2 horses that were sacrificed, as well as spears, gaming pieces, and a hat. And so this has become a really iconic contrast and controversial discussion point of a chamber grave of the 10th century that has been reinterpreted. And, these are the different images of the grave as a seated warrior's burial for a woman of high status. Perhaps she was a military commander, and perhaps not typical, but an exceptional person who was given an exceptional honor of a masculine style burial. Now, the question is, did she live her life as a warrior? Was this simply a symbol of status? Was this something that shows a more complex identity? But the artifacts speak, and now the DNA evidence speak of a powerful statement of theatre and display and honouring the person with, lavish grave goods. And their argument, which I haven't got time to go through in detail, is that if these weapons tell us that if this was male, we would assume it was a warrior. So why wouldn't we assume it was a warrior if it was a woman? And I think that's a valid point, but I would counter that by saying that we've often most archaeologists in the last 50 years have moved away from seeing all the objects put in graves as directly related to the identity of the person as they lived, but instead as part of this dialogue I was talking about between the living and the dead. I'm not saying she wasn't a warrior, but that this is perhaps a conversation the living are having to honor this person with heirlooms, with symbols, with someone who was different. We know she wasn't local, and she may have been part of the trading community. She may have been a merchant as much as a warrior, a powerful person of a powerful kin group, and part of that really distinctive trading settlement of Birka. And so calling her a high-ranking Viking warrior might not be wrong, but it perhaps is a bit misleading for popular audiences. There are certainly wide-ranging written source hints of women who may have performed on the battlefield from legendary saga literature, and scholars like Neil Price have made much of this. But my point would be that this person was clearly wearing a lot of Eastern references in their dress and would have stood out in terms of status and appearance, regardless of their gender. And there's a whole series of issues of interpretation with the published report that we could go through. But including we could start conversations about whether this person was transgender, whether they had a complex identity that was seen as contradictory or subversive in some way, and that the archaeologists who claim that all of the objects are necessarily martial or male is a bit misleading. Gaming pieces, I would contend, and horses are not gender specific in the Viking Age, unlike the report suggests. It's a symbol of status to be sacrificed with a horse, as we saw with the woman from Dalvik in Iceland. And gaming pieces are about elite leisure pastimes. They're not necessarily about military strategy, as the report contests. But still, there's a really interesting case study here of a powerful performance by the living of the dead in which weapons were selected for this person. Now, whether they are trying to honor her real life experience or a mythological idea of a Valkyrie or a shield maiden, and we have pendants that are being produced in southern Scandinavia showing women warriors in the we're finding more and more of these of women's hairstyles, long dresses, but with shields and swords and spears and riders. And of course, the Horby pendant is a famous and well discussed example of this. So clearly, the idea of women as combatants was a powerful and important one in mythology and legend, as well as perhaps in reality. And we have other graves that speak of a story that doesn't quite match up with gender norms, such as the Trikrona grave from Denmark, with a symbolic spear, it seems, that may denote a woman who may have been a seeress and had all manner of other odd objects, as well as a sacrificed horse and dog. Obviously, this is an artist's reconstruction. We don't exactly have this kind of quality of evidence, and there's some speculative choices here in this reconstruction about how she looked and how the animals were treated. But it gives you a sense of this vivid display in death and careful selection of objects for treatment of the dead. And for me, what's really interesting is this idea of interaction again, that maybe what we're looking at here is a society that's, this is from the TV show Vikings, by the way, showing you a dream sequence, almost like Jason and the Argonauts are fighting with skeletons. But what it helps me to remind you of, even though it's a TV show, is that maybe we're dealing with a society that thought very much about the dead as living on in their graves, needing dialogue, appeasement, conversation. Objects are part of that dialogue. And that may be the story of BJ 581 linked to these other case studies I've showed you, rather than this she was being buried as a warrior because she was a warrior in life. It's a much more nuanced view that helps us to think about the role of material culture in that remembering and forgetting, that process of remaking the dead. So was this a warrior woman or someone whose identity and the story being constructed in death was about they were fighting for, they needed to fight, whether it was symbolically or actually in reality in the grave context. And I wonder if this is as much about intimidation and protecting the settlement and the society and the physical landscape being remembered in that place as any simple equation with life history. Now, where I want to end with this, and I've got more slides that I think I've got time for, I'm just going to skip forward to talk about how we can apply the same approach. This is what I've been doing via social media a lot, is taking this back to our visions of the Vikings. And through my blog, and also digging into our Vikings, the TV shows, the games, the various How to Train Your Dragon representations, the Tolkien-esque representations, the Vinland Saga, anime and manga, and my blog, my vlog on YouTube and my TikTok account, to try and share and critique the way we think about these archaeological traces in the present, to try and sort of bring the evidence back into these sort of fantasy scenarios and stylizations. And I've argued very much that we can see the popular representations of Viking funerals in a positive way. We can tackle this, engage with this. And actually, I've made the point in an article that built on a blog post, that actually the most popular, well-known Viking funeral in modern culture is not actually a historical drama, a Bernard Cornwall novel, or a TV show. It's actually V for Vendetta, in which, in the original comics by Alan Moore and David Lloyd, the anti-hero slash hero is given a Viking funeral on an underground train that blows up the fascist government of this futuristic and now all too disturbingly close to home future for Britain. And the film version in 2005 adapts this to the noughties from the 80s and has a different destination for the underground train and V's death. But it's still playing with this idea of a Viking funeral as an explosive transformation in death. And I think that we can use that as a model and a way of thinking about how we approach the pop culture of Vikings in our society, that we don't have to sit back and just tut and shake our head and go, oh, they've got that a bit wrong in that film, or that sword's a bit in the wrong place, or I don't like that cow, it's a bit too big for the period, or that chicken's wrong, or those kind of like fact-checky debunking of everything from the latest cringeworthy quasi-historical drama on the BBC, King and Conqueror, or anything else. But instead, we can say, look, this is our Vikings. These are our Vikings. These are informed by archaeological ideas, even if they're not accurate. And there's many powerful stories we can tell with this Viking evidence. And so this doesn't mean I indulge and I'm sympathetic with all of the nonsense. But if I can quickly zip forward to the King and Conqueror. So when we have, this is from the just released episode 7 of the 8-part drama. A bit of a spoiler for you. Harold Godwinson beats the Vikings at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. I know that'll be a shocker for you all. But what is a shocker is that he then burns his brother on a pyre overlooking the North Sea as a Viking. Why? Who knows? Perhaps the TV shows just thought that'll be the type of thing that happened in the 11th century. You know, there's many layers of nonsense here. But I think what's really cannot be denied, and they're watching Halley's Comet go over, they haven't noticed it before, even though it probably was visible in the sky 6 months earlier. But you know, we can laugh and let's do it. But equally, we can say there's something really powerful here. The Vikings capture our imagination, and the Viking deathways are still with us as they were with Frank Dix's images in the 19th century, this painting. So we've still got this powerful image of the Vikings in death. And so what has this got to do with Cornwall? And that's my final point I want to take it to. You know, if we're going to dig into Viking funerals and think about how there are spaces of interaction, whether it's in the pagan period or during conversion, whether we're looking at, and we can do the same, we can dig into our popular culture and critique the various ways that the Viking funerals are being shown to us, claiming to be authentic, and of course they're often not. We can also take this back and look at how varied the Viking world is, and whether we're dealing with the Isle of Man, Brittany, Estonia, the Faroes, or indeed Cornwall, we cannot escape the Vikings. The Vikings are part of this late 8th to 11th century, but 9th to 11th century especially, way of thinking about the Viking world. And if we're happy to have Arthurian images banded around our English heritage sites, whether we like it or not, you know, or shouldn't perhaps said that, we certainly should perhaps be thinking that whether we like it or not, we should tackle the Vikings, not simply in terms of the Viking, as external threat, but as the Viking Age in Cornwall, as a way of grabbing people's attention, to both give them some engaging stories and to challenge misrepresentations and misunderstandings. And I think that's where we can use the funerals, we can dig into the funerals and start to sort of work out, what are we doing with these Vikings and how can we bring their story to bear on our archaeological evidence? Now, I don't have too much to say about the archaeology of Cornwall itself, and it would be easy to say, well, there's nothing Viking because there's nothing, there's perhaps no furnished Norse burials or no convincing evidence of Norse-style settlement, or the artifacts there are probably either indirectly traded, and you can sort of make this argument for an insular Cornwall that's not affected by the Viking world. And many an edited collection on Viking archaeology, many a book has at least 1 or 2 references to Cornwall by accident, not even in passing. And so it's easy for Cornwall to be avoided as part of this Viking phenomenon. But I think there's a lot of opportunity here to have conversations about these centuries, so important for understanding the history of these islands and Cornwall's place in it, by tackling these, being aware that whether we like it or not, people are going to be exposed to this, thinking about this, and this is a way to get people thinking about early medieval Cornwall. That's a lot of stuff, I know, but I think the idea of, if we're interacting with the dead in the past by trying to interpret how past people dealt with their dead, we can do it for our own popular culture, and then we can take the fight back, as kind of V for Vendetta does, take the fight back to the people that would just grift off the past and make up nonsense, we can actually tell some really cool stories using the Viking Age. And we can do better than this. We can do better than King and Conqueror. Really, we can. And I go too much whaling, but the Last Kingdom's okay, but too much whaling for me. But all of these are ways that people are getting exposed to the early Middle Ages. We can just sit there and tut and frown, or we can say, look, these are ways we can start the conversations. What do we actually know that's building on this, and how do we deal with the evidence in engaging ways? So whether we like it or not, I think we have to think about the Vikings in Cornwall, whether we think they're actually Scandinavians or in Cornwall or not. I hope that makes some sense and it perhaps sparks some interest and some questions. Thank you so much for giving me the time. And I'm so sad that Andy isn't here to hear me talk about this. But thank you.
Thanks, Howard. I think I've just been unmuted. I'm Mike Atwell, who's certainly not a medieval archaeologist or an archaeologist of medieval times. But interestingly, some of the ideas you're raising would apply to chamber tombs in the Neolithic.
Yes.
About the issues of movement and people reusing and all of those things. So I think the whole debate about, it would apply a bit to the Bronze Age, but I think particularly early Neolithic period, it's very interesting. There's a few comments come so far. George says there are 5 known hogback grave markers in Cornwall.
That's right, yeah.
Hogback is specifically Anglo-Dane, so there are at least 5 burials in Cornwall.
Yeah.
Laura has said, we have evidence of a Viking raid in Padstow.
Yeah.
We also have Julie in the audience, who's done a lot of work on Viking artifacts in Cornwall. So we know that there was a Viking presence here.
Yes.
At least to some degree. And she's excited for the new book. The new book due for publication soon.
Nice.
George again, Trewhiddle Hoard, Cardinham Cross, Borstal Strap End. So I think what people are saying at the moment is yes, there is an evidence, but we don't really necessarily know quite how widespread it was. I think probably would be that we've got indicators rather than detail. Other than that, at the moment, you seem to have stunned people to silence, which is
well. But may I at least take the opportunity to come back and say the point?
Yeah.
The point here is that whether we like it or not, the parameters of the Viking, different scholars have different approaches to the parameters of the term Viking and how it's applied. And some would prefer a much more retrenched, restricted use to refer to actually the activities of Scandinavian originating raiders, traders, and others would just use it as a chronological, dumping ground. And I tack between the two in my teaching and my research, because this term is, like all these terms, a massive curse and an opportunity. And it's about working out where and when it is. And so we should, my encouragement is for us to be not so much fixated on the labels, but where and how they're used effectively to get people interested, whether it, and to identify those that are trying to misuse those terms for more, should we say, ideological or partisan purposes within our popular culture and political discourse. So I think it's really important to not shy away from these words and these terms. We know that they're problematic. Most of my conversations online about people explaining to me what the Vikings were and what the Vikings did, and I go, yes, but here's what so we should be talking about these terms, but it's about making sure we frame what we mean by them. So yes, so if you're talking about hogbacks in Cornwall, we have a specific connections there to the, as you say, the Anglo-Danish world of the 10th century. It's not just a generic reference to all of the Scandinavian context. It's about using it as a way in to start those conversations. I suppose that's what I'm getting at.
Right. I'm sorry. I'm focusing a little bit on the screen because you
Okay.
have just prompted a range of new comments.
Oh, really?
It says initially, it seems in Wales the concrete evidence is around the coast.
That's correct.
So it seems very likely that in Cornwall it would be also. this, although that's not Llanivert really, en route between Brittany, Isles of Scilly, Isle of Man, etc.
Yeah.
Academics tend to miss Cornwall entirely, ignored facts and finds, and labelled them incorrectly. And then we've got a question: have there been any evidence of bone adaptations amongst warrior men's skeletons, which could be applied to female skeletons?
Well, that's a common point, JP, and a common point that's raised. That the problem is, there's different ways of putting this, but let's put it this way: the idea of a Viking warrior is a bit of a nonsense anyway. There's a brand new peer-reviewed article about this come out that's trying to re-energize the concept of what is a warrior in the Viking Age. But we're basically looking at farmers doing summertime raiding, right? Most of the time. I mean, there's some qualifications to that, and so we're really, most people in the Viking Age are fishing and farming, and hunting. So there's no distinctive traits, unlike when you start to get professional soldiery in the later Middle Ages, and you can start all this, the longbow, the actual poundage or whatever the term is, you're seeing stress indicators of bowmen and specific kinds of activities. So no, most people with trauma injuries are unlikely to have got them through being warriors, but through being the victims of violence, and that could take place in the Middle Ages, as most periods, in arguing with your neighbours over which cow's which, or which sheep's which. So I don't think we have any determined osteological traits that can allow us to go into that territory of proving who's a warrior or not based on the presence or absence. Whereas if you get into the 15th century Battle of Towton skeletons, you can start to sort of see inferences in their osteobiography of strain and musculature that suggest this person was a veteran warrior at the time of their death at Towton, for example.
Okay, we've got Jennifer saying she realises saying it seems likely is not the same as evidence, but
yeah.
And then we have so here's a wild idea for Castilie, Henge. Given how close it is to Llanivert and Cardinum, any Vikings there? I think that's just flying a kite because of the Castilie excavation at the moment. They're hoping that wonderful Viking brooch is going to appear from the middle. That's the key find.
You never know. They turn up everywhere. Although my curse of excavations is the Romans turn up everywhere. But you never know. You never know, because I mean I remember a certain excavation I took place as a student in northern Scotland, where it was a Neolithic monuments that turned out to be Bronze Age, excavating with Richard Bradley from the University of Reading. And I said as a joke, I bet you find some Pictish period, early medieval burials here, and they did. But they all laughed at me. I wasn't some visionary. I said it to try and wind them up, as I was the only early medievalist on the excavation. But you never know what turns up. Is my point.
There's again just more examples: Silverstrap and Neoprobus. We have an early medieval church dedicated to Olaf II of Norway.
Yes,
that's a and his father was involved in some of the Viking raids. And that's from Laura again, and George saying, as well as archaeology, I also do reenactment portraying Cornish and Dane in the Viking Age.
Fantastic. And why not? I mean, like an example from my area, the local archaeologists are also reenactors. They rock up to the Viking festivals as early medieval Welshmen, and they're not pretending to be anything else. Just Viking is the label that gets people in the festivals, and they're all part of the same communities. And then maybe they'll be doing a 12th century event, and they'll adapt a little bit of their kit. But the point is, it's terribly, I don't know, shameful of me to say it, but it's a gateway drug. It gets people into the early Middle Ages. Whereas if you said Anglo-Danish or Cornish, a hyphenated something, people are going, but it's a way of getting people started. And I think we shouldn't be too precious about that if that's a way in.
Right, and we've got Pete Herring saying, Castilian Llanivert, the possibility that Llanivert was such an important Christian centre because of proximity to Castilie Henge, a very obvious ancient earthwork being excavated at the moment by Olaf Bayer.
Hey!
Emphasis on the Olaf.
that proves it.
Yes.
No, I mean the problem is there's a lot of fantasy and silliness that attracts to the Viking label. But I think it is a way, whether I like it or not, if I do any social media activity, mention the word Viking, it'll get 20, 30 times the interest of anything else. I don't make that prop. That's the way it is. And it's,
you mean Anglo-Dane doesn't go down as well?
not really, not really. So but as long as you can pivot to quickly going sort of a Viking burial, let's talk about it, and then you actually tell them what it is. As long as you take them on a journey rather than just stay at that sort of soundbite, then I think it can be okay. But
any more there? It's gone quiet on the screen. You don't have to say something. Okay, in which case I just say thank you to Howard, and there's many thanks coming up on the screen. It was certainly a stimulating perspective on death and burial, I think, which is for me as a prehistorian, it made me think about something. So thanks ever so much, and hope all goes well with your reenactments.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Really appreciate the invite, and it's real pleasure to digitally be in Cornwall for an evening. It's been wonderful.